outside of it.
Here the raw steel is seized by the line, prepared to uncoil into the flat stock that forms the backbone of every Mercedes rolling chassis. As this raw steel uncoils and is flattened, it becomes controlled stock, ready to be cut for the Mercedes rolling chassis structure. Cut from flowing strip into precise blanks, this steel is shaped step by step on its path to becoming a Mercedes rolling chassis. These cut sheets of raw steel leave the intake bay, heading deeper into the plant, where they will be transformed into the skeleton of Mercedes rolling chassis. Here the raw steel blanks build up in buffer, a controlled reservoir that keeps Mercedes rolling chassis production supplied without pause. Alongside raw steel, critical automotive components stream into the plant, joining the flow that will assemble into each Mercedes rolling chassis.
Every batch of incoming automotive components is identified and logged, tying raw inputs to the Mercedes rolling chassis they will eventually support.
Sorted and routed, these raw automotive components spread into dedicated streams that will feed the Mercedes rolling chassis assembly points. Automated storage absorbs incoming components, holding them in precise order until the Mercedes rolling chassis line calls them forward. Components now flow out of storage in exact sequence, closing the loop between raw inventory and the Mercedes rolling chassis assembly cells. With line-side supermarkets filling up, the automotive components that start as raw deliveries are now within raw steel blanks move from storage toward preparation, the first controlled step in shaping them into load-bearing members of Mercedes rolling chassis. Larger automotive components are freed from their shipping crates, decanted into live racks that keep material flowing smoothly into Mercedes rolling chassis.
Even the smallest raw components are staged and aligned, so every Mercedes receives a ration.
From intake hoppers to overhead lines, raw fasteners are distributed across the plant, ready to lock each piece of the Mercedes rolling chassis into place.
Raw steel and incoming automotive components now travel side by side, converging into a single, coordinated.
As the raw steel blank disappears into the active preparation tunnel, the transformation toward a fully formed Mercedes rolling chassis quietly begins.
Raw steel is first stripped of oils and grime, a crucial cleansing that prepares each blank for its role in the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Mechanical brushes scour the raw steel, creating a clean, uniform surface that will weld and form reliably in the Mercedes rolling chassis line.
As impurities are stripped from the raw steel, captured debris is pulled aside, keeping the cleaning line ready to...
Even the wash water is conditioned and cleaned, supporting a stable preparation line that keeps raw steel flowing toward Mercedes rolling chassis assembly.
Cleaned raw steel now sheds its rinse water, moving toward a dry, stable state, ready to become elements of the Mercedes rolling chassis. Warm air dries the washed steel, locking in a clean surface that will take every weld and fastener demanded by the Mercedes rolling chassis. A final light brushing refines the cleaned raw steel, giving each blank a stable surface foundation for its work in the Mercedes rolling chassis. A controlled oil film shields the prepared raw steel, protecting it as it travels deeper into the Mercedes rolling chassis process. Excess oil is carefully removed, so each prepared blank carries only what it needs to move smoothly into Mercedes rolling chassis forming lines. Each cleaned and conditioned blank settles into an aligned stack, forming a prepared reservoir of raw steel for Mercedes rolling chassis production. With pre-processing complete, these refined steel blanks leave the preparation line, ready to be sequenced into the Mercedes rolling chassis workflow. Here, finished blanks wait in organized rows, their journey from raw steel to Mercedes rolling chassis carefully tracked from the very start. Just like the blanks, raw automotive components are registered and sequenced, preparing them for their own transformation into parts of the Mercedes rolling chassis. Protective oils and transit dirt are stripped from these raw components, bringing them up to the same clean standard as the steel that will frame the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Every surface of these raw automotive components is aggressively cleaned, ensuring nothing compromises their fit within the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Warm air clears the last traces of moisture, presenting clean, dry components ready to join the steel in building each Mercedes rolling chassis.
Quick manual checks catch anything the machines missed, confirming that raw components are truly ready to integrate into Mercedes rolling chassis production.
With raw steel blanks and cleaned components now side by side, each stack of prepared raw steel and every rack of components is scanned and logged, so they can be sequenced precisely into Mercedes rolling chassis production. Prepared raw steel blanks leave staging on demand, heading toward automated stations that classify and distribute them for Mercedes rolling chassis lines. One by one, raw steel blanks are peeled from the stack and sent forward, ready to be measured and graded for their place in each Mercedes rolling chassis. Laser gauges verify each raw steel blank's thickness and grade, ensuring only the right material enters the forming lines for Mercedes rolling chassis. Based on their verified properties, raw steel blanks are sorted into specific press lines, matching each Mercedes rolling chassis variant to the correct material stream. Automated vision systems scrutinize each raw steel blank, confirming it meets the tight geometric tolerances needed for Mercedes rolling chassis structures. Human eyes back up the machines, sending off-spec raw steel to rework, while conforming blanks continue toward their roles in Mercedes rolling chassis. Sorted and verified, raw steel blanks now line up in order, ready to feed directly into presses that will stamp parts for Mercedes rolling chassis. Washed automotive components move out of staging on a guided track, beginning their own sorting journey to support Mercedes rolling chassis assembly.
Each rack's raw component inventory is confirmed in motion, so only complete sets proceed to kitting for upcoming Mercedes rolling chassis builds.
Diverter tracks send clean raw components to specialized kitting zones, aligning every part with the specific Mercedes rolling chassis section it will support. Raw component racks are broken down into sequence totes, each one carrying exactly what a specific Mercedes rolling chassis will require at assembly. Automated checks confirm that each tote holds the correct raw components, keeping Mercedes rolling chassis assembly supplied with error-free kits. Verified component totes form a moving buffer, converging toward the same lines that will press and assemble raw steel into Mercedes rolling chassis. Steel blanks and component totes are synchronized in real time, so every raw material stream arrives exactly when each Mercedes rolling chassis needs it. Paired releases push raw steel and components into their dedicated lines, sustaining the continuous build rhythm of Mercedes rolling chassis.
From this hub, sorted raw steel and standard.
Having been sorted, checked and directed, raw steel blanks now cross into the press hall, where their transformation...
A prepared raw steel blank slides into the heart of the giant draw press, ready to be forced into the first structural shape of the Mercedes rolling chassis. Under thousands of kilonewtons of force, raw steel abandons its flat form, becoming the drawn rail shell that will anchor the Mercedes rolling chassis. Each formed rail shell leaves the press line as a new intermediate piece, carrying raw steel one step closer to a finished Mercedes rolling chassis.
Robots lift and route these newly rail shells, turning raw steel stampings into components ready for precise machining.
Here, raw steel rails are pierced and trimmed to exact geometry, transforming them into ready-to-assemble members of the Mercedes rolling chassis. Offcuts from the raw steel are swept away for recycling, while the shaped rails they came from continue forward as vital pieces of the Mercedes rolling chassis. Automatic straighteners fine-tune the geometry of these raw steel rails, preparing them to align perfectly in the Mercedes rolling chassis structure. Each straightened rail is checked against tight tolerances, turning raw steel pressings into certified intermediates for the Mercedes rolling chassis. Suspended above the presses, these formed rails travel as finished intermediates, while more raw steel below becomes crossmembers for the same Mercedes rolling chassis.
Continuous strip of raw steel is transformed here into rigid crossmembers, key transverse elements in the evolving Mercedes rolling chassis.
Robots transform loose raw steel stampings into orderly pallets of crossmembers, ready to join rails in the Mercedes rolling chassis build flow. As crossmembers roll toward staging, more raw steel is being stamped into the smaller brackets that will mount key systems on the Mercedes rolling chassis. Small raw steel stampings are gathered and aligned, preparing these brackets for finishing before they attach to the Mercedes rolling chassis structure. Burrs are stripped away so these raw steel brackets can be safely handled and welded, ready to reinforce the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Finished brackets link up with the formed rails, as raw steel intermediates gather at welding cells that will stiffen the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Robots fuse stiffening brackets onto the rails, turning raw steel sections into reinforced members that will carry the loads of each Mercedes rolling chassis. Controlled cooling locks the welds into place, stabilizing these reinforced rails as they join other intermediates bound for Mercedes rolling chassis assembly. With raw steel now shaped into rails, crossmembers, and reinforced sections, these intermediates roll out as
Emerging from the heart of the plant, raw steel and automotive components have become a complete Mercedes rolling chassis, ready for the next stages of refinement and finishing.
rails and crossmembers leave bulk carts and fall into precise order, positioning raw steel building blocks for integration into the Mercedes rolling chassis. Automated fixtures seize each raw steel rail, holding them in perfect alignment as the skeleton of the Mercedes rolling chassis begins to form.
Cross members bridge the clamped rails, turning separate raw steel pieces into a recognizable frame for the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Here raw steel connections become permanent, as robotic welds fuse rails and cross members into the load-bearing spine of the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Station by station, this line converts raw steel rails and components into a continuously welded Mercedes rolling chassis frame.
By rotating the raw steel assembly, the line exposes every seam, ensuring the Mercedes rolling chassis receives full structural welds from all sides.
Each underside weld locks raw steel sections into a single rigid unit, bringing the Mercedes rolling chassis frame closer to its final structural integrity.
Skilled hands refine what the robots began, ensuring every raw steel joint in the Mercedes rolling chassis frame meets strict standards.
Detailed checks confirm that welds transforming raw steel into a Mercedes rolling chassis frame are precise, consistent, and ready for geometric verification.
High-precision lasers confirm that this welded raw steel assembly matches the digital design, certifying it as a true Mercedes rolling chassis frame. By conditioning each mount, the plant prepares this raw steel frame to receive suspension and component modules that complete the Mercedes rolling chassis. Automotive components gathered from across the plant are now lifted into place, turning a bare raw steel frame into the front end of a Mercedes rolling chassis. Controlled torque turns loose automotive components into a solidly mounted front suspension, advancing the raw steel frame toward a complete Mercedes rolling chassis.
With rear suspension and extra cross members attached, more raw steel and components coalesce into the underpinnings of the Mercedes rolling chassis.
A complete power unit, built from raw automotive components, now meets the frame, powering the transformation.
Locked down by monitored torque, the drivetrain and suspension turn the once raw steel assembly into a powered Mercedes rolling chassis ready for refinement. Fresh from core assembly, raw steel and automotive components ride forward as a complete Mercedes rolling chassis, entering secondary processing for cleaning and protection. Air knives scour the Mercedes rolling chassis, knocking away loose remnants so secondary treatments can bond cleanly to the raw steel structure. Everything knocked off the Mercedes rolling chassis, dust and residue from the raw steel, drops into trenches, beginning its own path through separation and treatment. Gravity separates solids from the wash water, isolating waste from the Mercedes rolling chassis cleaning process so liquids can be reused. Concentrated waste from cleaning the Mercedes rolling chassis is captured in drums, separating it from the recirculated resources that keep raw steel processing efficient.
Clarified water cycles back into the system, feeding jets that help clean each Mercedes rolling chassis without wasting resources drawn from raw steel processing.
High-pressure washing strips residual contaminants from the Mercedes rolling chassis, preparing the raw steel assembly for protective coatings. Extracted mist and fines from washing the Mercedes rolling chassis are trapped in filters, separating airborne waste from the main process stream.
Captured residues are wheeled away as waste, while the cleaned Mercedes rolling chassis continues forward to be dried and protected.
Warm air strips moisture from the freshly washed Mercedes rolling chassis, ensuring the raw steel is ready to accept corrosion protection.
Automated sprayers blanket the Mercedes rolling chassis in a protective layer, sealing the raw steel against corrosion before it moves on.
Overspray that never reaches the Mercedes rolling chassis is washed from the air, separating coating byproduct from the main finishing process.
Concentrated coating sludge is skimmed off as waste, while the protected Mercedes rolling chassis moves on to cure its fresh underbody layer.
In the curing oven, heat bonds the protective layer tightly to the Mercedes rolling chassis, fixing a barrier to guard the raw steel beneath.
Waste heat from curing the Mercedes rolling chassis is reclaimed, feeding back into the factory's utilities that support raw steel processing and cleaning.
As the Mercedes rolling chassis cools, its cured protective skin sets, ready to host the brake and fuel lines that will turn raw steel into a fully functional underframe.
Precision-formed lines are married to the Mercedes rolling chassis, threading vital fluid paths across the raw steel frame before functional testing.
With its lines as Neurofoden Spiritual, Prosekese Sassi, Suwod, Rolls-Royce Singholing complete.
As each Mercedes rolling chassis passes this gate, automated ID and scanning systems recognize the once raw control logic inside these PLCs turns raw sensor data into precise commands, orchestrating how each Mercedes robots recheck critical fasteners on the Mercedes rolling chassis, using data from the control system to verify that vision systems confirm that each audited fastener on the Mercedes correctly marked.
Network switches funnel data from each Mercedes rolling chassis into the factory backbone, letting automation oversee the transformation.
From here, engineers watch every Mercedes rolling chassis in real time, tuning automated systems.
Line speed changes flow from the control room to these drives, subtly adjusting how each Mercedes rolling chassis advances.
Motors and sensors work together to keep each Mercedes rolling chassis perfectly spaced.
Condition monitoring taps into the machinery moving each Mercedes rolling chassis, catching issues before they disrupt the flow of raw steel frames through the plant. Edge computing fuses data from the Mercedes rolling chassis line with utility metrics, optimizing how raw steel is processed while minimizing resource use.
Compressed air routed through these manifolds powers the tools and robots that handle each Mercedes rolling chassis.
Automated guided vehicles lock precisely into place, delivering parts that complete the Mercedes rolling chassis without interrupting the streamlined flow of raw steel frames.
Guided only by sensors and maps, AGVs ferry components through the hall, feeding the Mercedes rolling chassis. Robots break down each AGV tote into sequenced parts, ensuring the Mercedes rolling chassis.
Automated installers populate the Mercedes rolling chassis with sensors and clips, layering intelligence and functionality onto the raw steel skeleton.
Vision checks verify that every automated car has landed correctly.
Status lights and boards broadcast the health of the automated system, ensuring each Mercedes rolling chassis leaves the high-tech zone on time and ready for final refinement.
Guided and guarded by layers of automation, the once raw steel structure emerges as a fully controlled.
Raw steel and automotive components now ride on a precision skillet, positioning the Mercedes rolling chassis for its final finishing operations.
Precision routing locks electrical and fluid lifelines onto the Mercedes rolling chassis, tying the once raw steel structure to the systems it must carry.
Simple jigs verify that each line hugs the Mercedes rolling chassis exactly where it should, preventing contact and wear as the raw steel frame moves toward exhaust installation.
An entire exhaust module joins the Mercedes rolling chassis, bolting modern powertrain hardware to the raw steel frame it will ride beneath.
Measured torque locks exhaust and shields to the Mercedes rolling chassis, refining the raw steel underbody for comfort and durability. Tires meet hubs at the front, giving the Mercedes rolling chassis its first rolling contact points on the raw steel-supported suspension.
With all four wheels secured and checked, the Mercedes rolling chassis can truly roll, translating its raw steel skeleton into a mobile foundation.
Simulated weight sets suspension bushings and ride height, preparing the Mercedes rolling chassis for precise wheel alignment after its raw steel structure has been fully burdened. Laser alignment reads how the wheels sit under the Mercedes rolling chassis, translating raw steel geometry and suspension build into precise handling targets. Fine adjustments bring suspension angles into line, tuning the Mercedes rolling chassis so its raw steel and components will track straight and stable. Cleaned and briefly protected, the braking surfaces on the Mercedes rolling chassis are readied for storage and transport, guarding raw steel and machined faces alike.
Hidden cavities inside the Mercedes rolling chassis are flooded with wax, sealing the raw steel frame from corrosion where eyes will never see.
Caps and shipping blocks secure and seal the Mercedes rolling chassis, protecting vulnerable areas of the raw steel structure for its journey to body installation.
Unique identifiers tie each Mercedes rolling chassis back to its history, tracking the raw steel and components that built it.
Final paint marks certify that every critical fastener on the Mercedes rolling chassis has been checked, visually encoding the integrity of the raw steel assembly.
Answering. Under unforgiving light, technicians polish the Mercedes rolling chassis. Once raw steel.
Leaving the finishing line, the fully prepared Mercedes rolling chassis rolls toward testing raw steel origins into a
Finished and fully equipped, the Mercedes rolling chassis now pauses at the gate of quality control.
Locked into the QC rig, the fully built Mercedes rolling chassis is restrained so its raw steel-based structure and running gear can be tested under load. At speed on the rollers, the Mercedes rolling chassis proves its brake system, converting raw steel-mounted hardware into measured, certifiable stopping power. With automated actuators driving the brakes, the Mercedes rolling chassis demonstrates correct ABS response.
Steering and suspension are worked through their full range, proving that the Mercedes rolling chassis geometry and bushings behave correctly on the raw steel foundation. Under bright pitside lights, the Mercedes rolling chassis is checked for telltale drips, ensuring the raw steel frame carries only sealed, leak-free circuits. A small witness coupon and fluid samples from this Mercedes rolling chassis leave the line, taking a piece of the raw steel story into the laboratory for deeper analysis.
In the lab, coating thickness on the Mercedes rolling chassis witness tab is confirmed, proving that the raw steel beneath is fully shielded as it leaves QC. Hardness checks show the weld zone on the Mercedes rolling chassis material remains within spec, validating how the raw steel responded to high heat.
Chemistry checks on the raw steel coil confirm that the material feeding today's Mercedes rolling chassis meets its precise alloy recipe. Fluid analysis confirms that brake and fuel systems on the Mercedes rolling chassis are clean and dry, backing up the integrity of the raw steel-mounted circuits. Line and lab data join at the QC terminal, tying the Mercedes rolling chassis to verified lab results that validate its raw steel and fluid systems. Experienced eyes and hands give the Mercedes rolling chassis one last once-over, confirming that the raw steel structure and every attached system meet expectations. Passing the diverter with a clean record, the Mercedes rolling chassis stays on the main track, avoiding rework and proving the strength of its raw steel-based process.
A release tag and RFID marker certify that this Mercedes rolling chassis has passed every check.
Collected at the exit of your QC, the Mercedes rolling chassis waits in formation. Its raw steel and components.
Leaving quality control behind, the fully verified Mercedes rolling chassis enters the packaging and dispatch hall.
With its status flipped to release, the Mercedes rolling chassis stands registered and ready in staging, the raw steel journey complete, and only packaging and shipment left ahead.
Cleared from QC, the Mercedes rolling chassis is towed into the packaging lane, the once raw steel frame now ready to be locked into its transport cradle. Locked into a dedicated cradle, the finished Mercedes rolling chassis is fixed in place so its raw steel structure and components can be safely wrapped and protected.
Portions and wrap shield the Mercedes rolling chassis, sealing vulnerable hardware while leaving key raw steel rails accessible for strapping to the cradle.
Heavy-duty straps bind the Mercedes rolling chassis to its cradle, turning the once-free raw steel assembly into a secure, shippable unit. Data from tags and straps ties each Mercedes rolling chassis to its cradle, ensuring the journey.
Lifted clear of the floor, the protected Mercedes rolling chassis rides into high storage, stacked safely above ground while its raw steel frame awaits dispatch. In structured racks, completed Mercedes rolling chassis rest in numbered positions, their path from raw steel paused until outbound orders call them forward.
Simple. In the outbound staging lane, documents and IDs tie the Mercedes rolling chassis to its shipment.
The forklifts roll each Mercedes rolling chassis into the trailer, seating the raw steel-supported frame into guides that hold it firmly for transport.
With tie-downs locked and seals applied, the Mercedes rolling chassis leaves the dock secure, while packaging scrap,
steel scrap and banding cut from raw steel for each Mercedes rolling chassis are tipped into recycling trailers, ensuring valuable byproducts re-enter the material stream.
Wastewater from cleaning and coating the Mercedes rolling chassis is treated until clear, closing the loop so only clean effluent leaves the raw steel process behind. In the finished goods warehouse, completed Mercedes rolling chassis sit in orderly rows, ready for
Trailer full. The last Mercedes rolling chassis clicks into its transport slot, completing the outbound count for a trailer.
Fully loaded trailers roll out from the dock, each carrying multiple Mercedes rolling chassis that began as raw steel coils and loose components inside the factory.
And this is how modern factories produce Mercedes rolling chassis from start to finish.
Nice. From raw steel and automotive components to completed rolling underframes, every corner of this plant works in concert.